I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Flora Gladwin.
And I'm Thomas Mills.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a couple concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways each of us can make a difference.
As a nonprofit focused on educating and empowering people to get involved in climate action, we rely on the financial support of our listeners. So, if you're a regular listener and you value what you get from us, consider a donation that aligns with that value.
All you have to do is head over to our website, climateoptimist.co, and click the donate button. And even $5 a month goes a long way to help us deliver our mission. But if you are short of cash but still want to help us out, just have your friends subscribe and rate us on your streaming platform.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, we really rely on you guys to help us spread our podcast. So the more that you can, give us good reviews and spread the word to your friends, it makes a huge difference. And speaking of podcasts, if you're looking for an extra podcast to download for, let's say, your upcoming road trip, we have a recommendation for you. When the People Decide is a podcast about how everyday people are shaping democracy and how you can too. The first season was about people who use ballot initiatives to bring issues that they care about directly to fellow voters, often bypassing state legislators who stood in their way. The second season, which starts July 17th, looks at cities and towns that are strengthening democracy at a local level. Learn about how residents of Petaluma, California won the democracy lottery and how Durham, North Carolina is turning over a portion of its budget to residents to spend. The podcast is a project of the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State and produced by LWC Studios. Encourage folks to go check it out.
Yeah, definitely worth the listen. Whew. So for this week's topic, we were just talking about how even 5 years ago, seeing a Tesla in some places was similar to Elon Musk going a week without tweeting something controversial, or a Republican member of Congress voting for a climate bill. In other words, it was very, very rare. Nowadays in 2023, the picture is obviously very different. Teslas and increasingly electric vehicles from other manufacturers can be found almost anywhere. So as we race to cut our emissions by half before 2030, EVs represent a critical part of the solution, especially in developed countries where transportation often makes up 25% or more of total emissions. And though we've talked electric vehicles before on this podcast, we thought today it might be time for an update on where things stand, challenges remaining, and of course, what to consider when buying one.
And before we dig into the details, want to highlight this week's reason for hope, which is that the shipping industry has set a course to phase out its greenhouse gas emissions. No pun intended. Would that be pun? What would that be?
That's a
Wordplay?
pun. Yeah.
The deal came at a meeting of the International Maritime Organization, ironically following the hottest day ever recorded on the planet, this last 4th of July. The targets are unfortunately non-binding, but they call for a 20% reduction in emissions by 2030, 70% by 2040, and net zero by 2050. More is definitely needed for shipping to do its part. According to the Clean Shipping Coalition, a 50% cut by 2030 is both possible and affordable, which, as most folks know, is kind of where we're aiming for in order to limit emissions to that 1.5 degrees Celsius mark. So I don't know. I feel like it was incremental progress. Thomas, what are your thoughts?
Too little, too late, Jason? I don't know. I think that the shipping industry needs a bit of a makeover, similar to what we've seen with electric vehicles. I think as we've all sort of seen by the great progress made by the likes of Tesla and the Chinese EV manufacturing, it's about making the decision to fully commit to decarbonizing rather than sort of taking small steps now. Where I'm going with this really is I'm thinking foiling ships. So we've already seen companies like Candela, who I think are a Swedish boat manufacturer, build speedboats that are foiling, i.e. that they have a normal hull, but they've got basically small wings that go into the water. And once they get above a certain speed, that enables the ship or boat to lift its hull out of the water and dramatically reduces drag. So what that means is instead of building a great big ship that needs, 40,000 tons of batteries to go from the US to Australia, You're building a ship that requires 10,000 tons of batteries to cover the same distance. The added benefit too is that often they end up foiling at much higher speeds than they would if they were just sitting in the water. And so that may assist in allowing more freight that would otherwise go via air travel, which is even harder to decarbonize, to be taken as sea freight.
I know it's early days when it comes to taking, big ships and making them hydrofoil, but I think it'd be pretty amazing to see, shipping vessels go in that direction. I mean, you look at what's happened to, massive sailboats and others. I mean, for folks who aren't familiar with what a ship with a hydrofoil looks like, just Google it. It's pretty amazing. So, pivoting to our main topic, before we get into electric vehicles, benefits, what you should consider when buying, debunking some of the myths, we thought it would be important to kind of set some context on, why shifting to electric vehicles really matters. In the United States, for folks who may not be aware, transportation is now our largest source of emissions. Now, obviously, that contains things like shipping that we just talked about, aviation. But if you just look at cars and trucks, it's still about 23% of our total emissions. If you look at just passenger vehicles, the ones that, all of us drive, you're talking still 17%. So that's a huge chunk and a critical part of us being able to decarbonize, and a part where we already have the technology and it's readily available. When you look globally, it's still a pretty significant number. 12% of global emissions are tied to cars and trucks. So even outside the US, there's a ton of opportunity. The other thing that I think that's worth setting context on and doesn't get talked about enough is the air pollution that we all breathe from burning fossil fuels. Roughly 8 million people a year die prematurely because of inhaling, particulate matter associated with burning fossil fuels. That's more, for context, more deaths than, annual deaths than cigarettes and malaria combined. So there's obviously huge climate benefits associated with moving away from, internal combustion engines, but it's important too not to forget the other health benefits that has for all of us, especially folks who live, next to major roadways. So while EVs have got more popular, there are a lot of myths that are still out there. So we thought it might be worthwhile to spend a few minutes debunking some of those. Flora, I know you did a little research on the topic.
Yeah. I thought this was such an interesting thing to get into. For some context, Jason and Thomas, you know this, but for our listeners, I went to a super liberal, hippie, tree hugging school in Portland, Oregon for college. I mean, totally, right? And even there was just an impressive amount of skepticism around EVs, particularly Tesla, that I would hear from my peers. And, aside from the very obvious social aspect, thanks to Elon, a huge part of that skepticism is due to misinformation about both the, production and consequent emissions of electric vehicles. So I thought we could talk a little bit about, what I think are two of the biggest that I hear. The first myth being that EVs are just as bad emission-wise as internal combustion engine vehicles are. And the second, that EVs rely on coal in a way that is really similar to internal combustion engine vehicles. And there's a great article that I know Jason and I have both checked out that's by a guy named Johnny Lieberman for Motor Trend, and it's called You're Being Lied to About Electric Cars. And definitely we're going to link it for the episode. But I think one of the really interesting facts or ideas, I guess, that Lieberman brought up was this idea of direct and indirect emissions, which is meaning emissions that were created during the manufacturing process and those that are then emitted while driving the vehicle. So gas-powered cars obviously have both direct and indirect emissions. Meanwhile, electric vehicles only have those indirect emissions as they're outputting no greenhouse gases while driving is actually occurring. There's a great Yale study, which Lieberman cites in his paper, that says that about 74% of light vehicle CO2 emissions come after vehicle manufacturing when the car is actually being driven. So there's this really important point to consider when we're talking about, the impact that EVs are having emission-wise, which is this idea of direct versus indirect.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I almost like to think of it in terms of manufacturing and operating emissions. And manufacturing an electric car today generates more emissions than manufacturing an internal combustion engine. When you get to that operating phase, because it's so much bigger in terms of its contribution, that's where the difference comes. So even though producing the electricity to operate the electric vehicle does generate some emissions, it's dwarfed by the amount of emissions that an internal combustion engine creates, burning the fuel.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, do it, Thomas.
Oh, look, I was just
Hit
gonna
it.
pile on. Like, basically, in the US, it takes about, if you go and buy a Tesla Model 3, it takes about a year's worth of driving that compared to a regular internal combustion car that you bought at the same time, that's the same size, to make up for the additional emissions that occurred during the manufacturing of that vehicle. In Australia, it takes a little bit longer. It's closer to 2 years because our grid's quite dirty. But if your electric vehicle has been made by somebody that really does give a damn about the planet and has worked hard to use renewable energy wherever possible in the manufacturing of them, it's really only about a year's worth of operation of that vehicle before you're ahead of buying an internal combustion.
No, that's a great way to sum it up. And this second myth, I think really builds off of that, honestly, which is this idea that EVs rely on, coal or fossil fuels in a way that's really similar to internal combustion engine vehicles. And the fact of the matter is that electric vehicles are just far, far more efficient. There's a statistic that 87 to 90% of energy in an electric vehicle's battery is sent to its wheels. And meanwhile, internal combustion engine vehicles only send about 16 to 25% of energy from gas burning to their wheels, which is a massive amount of energy lost in all sorts of other things. So, yeah, I think there's honestly no comparison to be made there.
Yeah, and I mean, even in the situation in Australia where we have one of the dirtiest grids in the world because we still have so much coal and gas on the grid here, if you buy, let's say, a Tesla Model 3, it's the equivalent of buying running a petrol powered vehicle that gets over 50 miles per gallon. So, but the thing is with the electric vehicle, if you buy that electric vehicle today versus that 50 mile per gallon gasoline powered vehicle, with the grid improving year on year with more solar, more wind, more renewables coming online, there's a pathway for that to improve, but there is no pathway, as you've discussed, for the improvement in fossil fuels.
Yeah.
So I think you guys have covered, probably the two biggest rumors that are out there floating about electric vehicles. But the other one that's kind of out there that I think gets a lot of attention in environmental circles is that, batteries are sort of equally terrible for the environment as burning gasoline. I think the first thing to keep in mind is that while mining certainly can have negative impacts and this extraction of raw materials to create the battery, that isn't the same as what we're talking about with climate change. So no amount of mining is going to have the same sort of impact to the planet as climate change. We need to be mindful about how we mine these raw materials, but that shouldn't prevent us from doing what we need to move forward with electric vehicles. The other thing that I think people often say related to batteries is that they can't be recycled. Well, it's actually not the case. They aren't easy to recycle, but recycling is possible. And, there are facilities that are working to ramp up. And the other benefit of that recycling is that once you've extracted enough, let's say lithium to build the batteries that we need, then the recycling is feeding that back in so that you're not having to go out and pull more raw materials from the ground. So again, batteries are, have environmental problems for sure. They're not perfect, but I think we really just need to keep it in the context of the problems associated there and what we're facing with climate change, because the two are not the same.
And because they are made out of relatively high value raw materials, that puts a value on them for recycling. It incentivizes companies to set up facilities to take those products back and repurpose them. I take JB Straubel, for example, who a few years ago left Tesla. He was a chief technical officer at Tesla and created his own company, Redwood Materials, purely with the intent of recycling EV batteries. The bulk of the batteries now that come through the facility are actually consumer grade waste from your electric toothbrush to your battery drill, whatever it might be. And those materials that would formerly have just ended up in landfill, unfortunately, are now going through their facility, being repurposed and redirected to the electric vehicle industry.
Yeah, that's great news. And, we'll get into this when we talk about, I think, things to consider if you're a prospective EV buyer, but battery chemistries are changing too. And, the sort of predominant battery chemistry that's been out there in a lot of electric vehicles that involves, things like cobalt and nickel is really being phased out in in favor of, what are called lithium iron phosphate batteries. And we'll spare you the technical details, but they don't require those materials, which in essence reduces the negative impacts of trying to extract those rare earth items. So let's move to buyer considerations. Thomas, if you've got somebody who has heard good things about EVs, is ready to purchase a new vehicle, what should they be looking for in an EV?
I think, as you've already mentioned, battery chemistry is an important one. If you're looking for something that is bomb proof and going to last a long time, lithium iron phosphate is worth looking for rather than the older school nickel, cobalt, aluminium, or nickel, cobalt, manganese. So it is worth asking that. The reason being that these newer technologies will have a longer cycle life, and that it just means that the vehicle will have less battery degradation over time. And you can also charge them to 100% and leave them fully charged. Whereas the earlier EVs, you would only really charge to 80%, except when you were going on a road trip.
Yeah, my good friend Mike, who is a battery engineer, has also been educating me lately on the benefits of lithium iron phosphate. I think the one caveat is if you're looking for a vehicle today, and you're not finding one that has a lithium iron phosphate battery, don't let that be the reason you go out and buy a regular internal combustion engine. The existing battery technology today is still good. I have a Tesla Model 3. I've had it for 5 years, and it's been a great car. So lithium iron phosphate is certainly the future, but yeah, don't let it be that deal breaker between going electric or going back to gas.
Yeah, and the next thing to probably look at is how those batteries are cooled. And really, there's only one outlier here, and that is the Nissan Leaf. Don't buy them. They still use air cooled battery packs. And because of that, in hot climates, they really struggled to get the heat away from the batteries when you're fast charging. So they fast charge at absolutely terrible rates, and it creates hot spots in the battery, which ends up causing accelerated degradation rates. The other one to look at is probably range. Remember that the published versions, your mileage may vary, especially in Europe and Australia, where they use the WLTP and the NEDC standards. They're bollocks, right? The US EPA system is closer to the mark. It's reasonable if you drive sensibly that you will achieve close to EPA ranges in normal conditions, but keep in mind that in midwinter, there will be an impact on performance. And so in that situation, what you should also be looking for is, or asking the question, does the electric vehicle have a heat pump for cabin heating? If it's just relying on resistive element heating, it will use a lot more energy in the winter to keep the cabin and or the battery pack warm.
And if your head spinning and thinking, how am I going to remember all these great things that Thomas is telling us? We are going to have links to a couple good resources on our website, as well as sort of bulletized points, because there is a lot to keep track of with EVs. It doesn't have to be a complex process, though. And the good news is all the newer technologies are moving in the direction of, I think, Thomas, of what you're talking about. The other two things that I think are worth mentioning are the tax incentive structure. And I'm not going to be the one that speaks to what's going on in Europe, but here in the US, right now there is a federal tax incentive of $7,500 for new electric vehicles and $4,000 for used electric vehicles. Now there's restrictions around that. The good news is there's still a bunch of cars out there that meet the parameters of the tax incentive, And you can find those on fueleconomy.gov. If you just Google fuel economy, electric vehicles, tax incentive, it'll bring up the page. We'll link it as well on our website. But you can go in there and see exactly, which vehicles qualify for the tax credit.
And in addition, I think it's worth mentioning the benefits provided by different states. There's all these EV tax credits and rebates available by state, anywhere from Colorado, which gives tax credits ranging from $2,000 to $8,000, depending on vehicle type, to Florida, which does jack shit for EV purchasers. However, yeah. However, different utilities also provide tax credits or rebates in some cases, like in Colorado's case, where XL Energy offers a $3,000 rebate for the lease or purchase of a used EV and $5,500 for the lease or purchase of a new EV. So definitely worth taking
Pretty
a look.
generous.
I know, right? Not bad. So yeah, worth taking a look at what your state offers. There's definitely countless state level benefits for owning or leasing an electric vehicle or for installing a home charger. So we'll provide a link to a helpful article in our show notes so that if you want to check out the benefits offered where you live, which you absolutely should, you can.
The other thing I think that's worth considering is sort of the efficiency of the electric vehicle. Instead of a miles per gallon that you're used to seeing when you go buy a gas powered vehicle, electric vehicles in the US come with a MPGE, or miles per gallon equivalent. And it's a good way to sort of size up the efficiency of the car, and also really the amount of resources that goes into it. So for instance, the Tesla Model 3, since we've been using Tesla's benchmark, gets 132 miles per gallon equivalent. The Ford Lightning is only about 70. So already you've cut your efficiency about in half, which speaks to the fact that even though we're moving to electric vehicles, we should also still be trying to keep our vehicles smaller. The worst on the scale is the electric Hummer, which is only 47. In the big scheme of things, we really need to be thinking about how can we not just move to electric vehicles, but move to vehicles that have a lighter impact on the planet. And buying a Hummer is not one of those things. It consumes a massive amount of resources. And I think it sets the wrong precedent, which is that, somehow we can consume our way out of this problem when in reality we need to be consuming less. I don't know. Other thoughts, Flora, Thomas?
Better still, buy an e-bike. I mean, at the end of the day, you're using what? Probably like a decent e-bike has half a kilowatt hour of battery storage on board. So you're about 1/120th the amount of battery compared to even a Tesla Model 3. And you're going to get probably 30 times the fuel economy.
And I think it's more enjoyable in most conditions.
Oh, totally. Absolutely addictive. Can't get enough of it.
Well, I want to ask, have you guys heard about the solid state battery with Toyota? What's the story there? Or do we
No,
not?
pipe dream. I wouldn't even talk about it. Seriously, I think Toyota gets way too much airtime. Like, I am far more impressed
Yeah.
with what the Chinese are doing at the moment. I think this whole solid state thing with Toyota is just them trying to stall people from not going out and buying other people's vehicles. Because it's not like they've even got, masses of pre-production prototypes out there in the wild. They were just too late at moving on this. Everyone else is so far ahead of them.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Not to mention, they are one of the biggest lobbyists trying to stop the adoption of emission standards, fuel efficiency requirements, and electric vehicle adoption rates. So, yeah, I mean, there I was just giving them all this airtime, but basically they don't deserve any.
So I think in summary, for prospective buyers, there's a number of high level things to consider: your tax incentives, the efficiency of the vehicle, what kind of battery that you're purchasing, how it's cooled. Again, we'll have links on our website. I guess with that, are there any other EV related items we should be highlighting?
Yeah, I think probably this adoption of the North American charge standard by some of the EV companies in the US other than just Tesla. So basically, it was Tesla's proprietary connector, and they opened the standard recently. And well, the two most important ones, I guess, Ford and General Motors have now adopted it. And that will also give those drivers access to some, not all of, but the majority of Tesla's supercharger network. And basically everyone else is starting to pile on too. Outside the US, it doesn't really matter so much. But the other one was inductive charging. So, and I see this as the game changer. The reason is that I believe that electric vehicles are going to be a big part of the whole grid balancing in the future, because there is so much capacity in an electric vehicle compared to average household use, and it can participate as part of the grid is going to be monumental for allowing a larger penetration of renewable energy. And Elon has mentioned that by 2025, Teslas will have bidirectional charging capabilities, and that will likely be using a inductive charge pad, so you don't have to worry about plugging your car in anymore. And I suspect whatever Tesla adopts, the others will follow.
Wow, that's huge. I mean, that'll be really interesting to see how that'll help make the grid cleaner, how that will kind of have a little positive feedback loop going. That's going to be really, really fascinating to see how that develops.
Yeah, like there are quite a few studies underway at the moment regarding bidirectional charging and things, but they all require
Mhm.
that the driver gets home and plugs their car in straight away. And that's okay for the geeks among us that are trying to do the right thing for renewable energy, but for the average person, they don't care so much. They just want it to be seamless. And I think that they will participate because, of course, there will be some financial incentives involved in this as well. But so long as they just don't have to worry about it, it just does its thing.
It is exciting for sure, and it would be interesting to watch it. I don't know what that says about society, is that people can't, make the effort to go plug their vehicle in. But yeah, futuristic pull up and your car charges and can,
Whew.
release energy back to the grid. That sounds pretty sweet. Well, I think all this leads to the classic question that we always ask, which is, what can we do? And this week, I suppose it's the obvious. Consider making the leap to an electric vehicle. And that could be in different forms, right? So if you're looking for the car that can meet all your needs, where you need more range, you can go out and purchase that new EV or used EV. If you're still not convinced about where an electric vehicle fits into, your transportation options, consider go out and leasing them. There's some really great leasing programs out there that make for a cheap monthly payment, and it's sort of a risk-free way to try out the technology if you're not quite comfortable enough yet. And the best of all, which Thomas already plugged, is consider going out and trying that e-bike. Could sort of laugh about it, but if you're able to use that as a secondary transport option, it has huge benefits. Obviously, above and beyond just the benefits of the climate, in terms of saving resources, and they're more fun to ride anyway. So we'll have some helpful links in our show notes, again, to help hopefully make this a simpler process for everybody. But there's great EVs out there on the market today in almost every category. It was a little different a few years ago, but with where we are today, no matter if you're looking for a small SUV, a sedan, or you really need that truck, there are options out there for you. Any other thoughts, you guys?
No, I mean, except the fact that if you're not thinking about buying one, there might be somebody else that that is thinking about buying a new car. And the most important thing now is we should just not be bringing any new internal combustion vehicles onto the roads. Like their days are finished. So the work you can do to convince them to move in the right direction is work well done.
That's a great point, Thomas. The best way to convince somebody to take the leap to an EV is to hear from family and friends. So if you're an EV owner, enthusiast, get out there and spread the good word. So before we sign off this week, just wanted to make a quick announcement to our listeners. We're going to be taking a little summer vacation here on Climate Optimists. So our next episode will be airing on July 25th as scheduled, but then we're taking a 4-week break and back again on August 29th. So mark your calendars. Well, that's a wrap for this week's episode. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. Climate Optimists is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimists.co. And don't forget to follow us on social at Climate Optimist Podcast.